Well, it is also my distinct pleasure to welcome you back to the second day of the King James Bible and the World It Made conference. It is even more my pleasure to welcome our plenary speaker this morning, Dr. Laura Knoppers, professor of English at Pennsylvania State University. Receiving her BA from Calvin College and both her MA and PhD from Harvard, Dr. Knoppers is a leading voice in 17th century scholarship. Her insightful research has broadened our understanding of literature, politics, religion, and the visual arts in 17th century England, as well as our understanding of early modern women's writings, textual scholarship, and the history of the book. Although her publications and honors are far too numerous to list, I would like to highlight a few which relate to her topic this morning. She is currently the editor of Milton Studies, and her highly acclaimed 2008 volume in the Oxford University Press series on the complete works of John Milton was winner of the John Shawcross Award of the Milton Society of America. Her 1994 study, Historicizing Milton, Spectacle, Power, and Poetry in Restoration England, was also distinguished with recognition as a Choice Outstanding academic book. She is currently working on a new Milton book and also has two forthcoming books for 2011 and 2012. The first is with Cambridge University Press, Politicizing Domesticity from Henrietta Maria to Milton's Eve, and her book with Oxford University Press is The Handbook of Literature and the English Revolution, all of which we eagerly anticipate. Dr. Knoppers' paper this morning is Translating Majesty, the King James Bible, John Milton, and the English Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Knoppers.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you to all of our hosts here. This is my first time at Baylor, and it's such a beautiful campus that one is tempted to just walk around and enjoy the beautiful trees and flowers, and so I'm very pleased to be here. Maybe I'll make one prefatory comment. When I was growing up in a Baptist church in rural Michigan, I think we would have all been very surprised to hear about celebrating the anniversary of the King James Bible, because we never thought of it as a translation. So I think in some ways I'm going to the other extreme today, because you're going to see that I'm really trying to pin down very precisely the genesis and some of the cultural and historical forces that were shaping the early translation. And hopefully everyone has a handout. On the chilly afternoon of January 31, 1649, King Charles I stood on a recently erected scaffold outside of the banqueting house at Whitehall, awaiting execution. The public beheading was a crucial step in a struggle that had begun with paper bullets and parliamentary pamphlets and news books, moved through civil war and parliamentary victory to the king's trial and condemnation, and would continue even after the king's death. At each stage, Parliament strove to strip away from Charles Stuart both the tangible and ineffable attributes of majesty, crown, kingdom, power over the militia, and the link between earthly monarch and divine. Yet the scene on the scaffold gave evidence not only of Parliament's victory and its control of the judiciary and military, but also of beliefs that would be more difficult to eradicate. Charles I, having earlier taken communion and said his final prayers with his chaplain, Bishop Juxon, carried out his final act with dignity and determination. He wore extra clothing against the cold, not for comfort, but to prevent shivering that might be misconstrued as fear. Having avowed his innocence, the king affirmed his commitment to the established church and to the rights and liberties of the people, and he prepared to die. I have a good cause and a gracious God on my side. I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world. Stooping down and laying his neck on the block in preparation for the blow of the axe that would separate head from body, Charles cautioned the disguised executioner to stay for the sign, indicating his readiness. And actually, you have a little woodcut of the event on the front of your handout, and the executioner is not disguised here, but it was disguised in real life, and here you do at least see his very intimidating axe. The reply of the executioner, presumably the most hardened of characters, was striking, indeed, under the circumstances, remarkable. "Yes, I will, and it please your majesty." If the elaborate apparatus of public trial, sentencing, and punishment was meant to transform Charles Stuart into a criminal, a traitor, and tyrant, the axe-wielding executioner instinctively and readily acknowledges the king's majesty. Such majesty was a prominent feature of the authorized version of the Bible that had been commissioned by Charles's father, King James I, and published 38 years earlier. In translating Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts into English, drawing upon and amending earlier English Bibles, as well as having at hand such resources as the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, the King James translators highlighted majesty. In so doing, they created a text that not only shaped religious faith and practice, but would prove crucial to monarchy at a time of crisis. Before and after the English Civil Wars, regicide, and short-lived republic, Charles I and his supporters drew upon the King James Bible to stress the majesty, power, splendor, greatness, and divine right of monarchy. While considerable scholarly attention has been given to radical uses of the Bible in the English Revolution, this paper looks at less well-examined royal and royalist uses, as well as at the shifting responses by polemicist and poet John Milton. The majesty of kings and of the divine in the 1611 Bible became crucial, not despite, but because of the mid-17th century revolution. Part 1, the Hampton Court Conference and the Work of Translation. While in some ways his personality and uncouth habits might make King James I of England and VI of Scotland seem an incongruous figure to oversee a translation of sacred scripture, James delighted in theological debate, had translated the Psalms, and had written on divine right of kings. Convening the Hampton Court Conference in January 1604, like a good physician to examine and try the complaints and fully to remove the occasions thereof or to cure them, unquote, King James did more than pepper the hapless Puritan divines, outnumbered and outmaneuvered by a phalanx of bishops, clergymen, and professors. And he writes someone about how he peppered the Puritans soundly. When Puritan scholar John Reynolds moved His Majesty that there might be a new translation of the Bible because those which were allowed in the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original, unquote, James embraced the idea but turned it against the translation favored by the godly. The king replied that he wished that some especial pains should be taken in that behalf for one uniform translation, professing he could never yet see a Bible well translated in English. But the worst of all, His Majesty thought the Geneva to be, and this to be done by the best learned in both the universities, after them to be reviewed by the bishops and the chief learned of the church, from them to be presented to the Privy Council, and last to be ratified by his royal authority, and so this whole church to be bound unto it, and none other. From university scholars to bishops to the church, privy council, and king, hierarchy and order were to be observed and confirmed even by the process of the new biblical translation. Attentive to the Greek Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, and earlier English translations, including the Bishop's Bible, which they were specifically instructed to follow, the translators set out not so much to produce a wholly new work as to amend and polish what was amiss. A translator's preface included in the 1611 edition presented the work in terms that notably downplay the impact of translation on the meaning of the text. Likening their endeavors to opening or uncovering, the translators minimized any actual construction of meaning. And this is a quote, "Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell, that we may eat the kernel. that putteth aside the curtain, that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come by the water, even as Jacob rolled away the stone from the mouth of the well, by which means the flocks of Laban were watered. Other metaphors in the preface similarly depict the translation from one language to another, not as the creation of meaning or the construction of a conceptual world, but as polishing an already formed object. Quote, "For by this means it cometh to pass that whatsoever is sound already will shine as gold more brightly, being rubbed and polished. Also, if anything be halting or superfluous or not so agreeable to the original, the same may be corrected, and the truth set in place. And what can the king command to be done that will bring him more true honor than this?" This final question reveals that the process of translation would not be a simple opening up or disclosing, a burnishing or a polishing. Rather, in translating the King James Bible, the Jacobean scholars not only changed the text from one language to another, they also adapt ancient polity to early modern England. This Bible, in a process initiated and overseen by a king who believed firmly in divine right, evinces language that will bring that king true honor. Nonetheless, the translator's preface goes on to insist that words themselves have a kind of neutrality, that we have not tied ourselves to a uniformity of phrasing or to an identity of words, and that a wide vocabulary will be employed. The translators observe that, quote, "niceness in words was always counted the next step to trifling, and that we cannot find a better pattern for elocution than God himself. Therefore, he using diverse words in his holy writ, and indifferently for one thing in nature, we may use the same liberty in our English versions out of Hebrew and Greek, for that copy or store that he hath given us." And this is part 2, usages of majesty in the King James Bible. In this context, then, reiterated words in the King James Bible take on even more significance. And one important reiterated term, I would argue, is majesty. The word itself derives from the classical Latin, and core meanings in English are dignity of a god or exalted personage, or of an office, majesty, grandeur in a thing, an appearance, in language, or majesty of the people or state, the harming of which is seen as a crime. In 17th century England, majesty was most often used in reference to the greatness and glory of God, as well as the dignity or greatness of the monarch. Indeed, by the end of the century, majesty had almost always wholly superseded other customary forms of address to the sovereign in England. Yet with political tensions and the outbreak of civil war, other uses of majesty with reference to the law and justice came increasingly to the fore. As we shall see, John Milton's emphasis on majesty as the power and dignity of the people, drawn from the history of the Roman Republic, challenged and sat uneasily alongside both royal majesty and its biblical analog in the King James Bible. The word majesty appears 72 times in the text, headings, and notes of the King James translation, as well as an additional 18 times in the opening dedication to King James and the translator's preface. The proportion is heavily weighted toward the Old Testament and apocryphal books. 62 instances versus only 6 instances in the New Testament. As we shall see, some usages are unique to the King James, others are unusual but not unique, while others reaffirm the usage of earlier English Bibles. By examining the nature and significance of the uses of majesty in the King James translation, compared with such earlier English versions as the Miles Coverdale, 1535, the Great Bible, 1540, Thomas Matthew, 1549 edition, Bishop's Bible, 1568 edition, Geneva, 1587, and Reims-Dewey, 1582 to 1610. We will see a striking enhancement of certain kinds of majesty, particularly with respect to powerful monarchical figures linked with attributes of the divine. And let me just briefly say that there's a wonderful database that's called the Bible in English, where you can, when I specified particular editions of some of those early Bibles, that's because those are the ones that are on that database, and you can do all kinds of searches and compare and contrast the translations in those early Bibles. So I was working extensively with that database. Overall, in the context of the dedication and translator's preface, the uses of majesty in the King James Bible help to enhance an image of earthly monarchy closely linked with the divine. But we shall also see that such language of majesty came particularly to the fore, not in the calm of Jacobean compromise, but in the turmoil and upheaval of the foreshortened reign of James's son, King Charles I. And now you can turn to the second page of your handout, where I've given you a copy of, a portrait of James, looking very much as if he expects to be called Your Majesty, and by Paul van Summers, a Flemish artist. And then this is the translator's preface, or the dedication to James, which appeared first, and then was followed by the translator's preface, and then was followed by, which is very long, I don't know how many people have looked at that, and that was followed by there's other prefatory matter in that early printed book. So when people had the material object of the King James Bible, they wouldn't open it up and begin with Genesis 1, they would open it up and begin with this dedication to King James. The framework of the King James Bible would have impressed upon its readers the idea of majesty, and particularly the majesty of the king. The opening dedication to King James is not only in larger typeface than the rest of the Bible, but it uses the term majesty 11 times. The dedication highlights the king's sovereignty, power, and relation to the divine. From its laudatory opening line, "Great and manifold were the blessings, most dread sovereign, which Almighty God, the Father of all mercies, bestowed upon us, the people of England, when first he sent your Majesty's royal person to rule and reign over us," to references to the appearance of your Majesty as the sun in his strength, and to the zeal of your Majesty toward the house of God, majesty is the title of choice for the monarch. And such majesty links the earthly monarch with God himself. Having completed their work, the translators profess to hold it our duty to offer it to your Majesty, not only as to our king and sovereign, but as to the principal mover and author of the work. As king and sovereign, mover and author, James I resembles and embodies attributes most often seen in God himself. Given the translator's preference for a varied vocabulary, recurring words in the King James Bible warrant particular attention. It is striking that a variety of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek terms are rendered in the King James Version as majesty. The King James translators render as majesty 5 different Hebrew words, including gaon, height, pride, presumption, eminence; hadar, adornment, splendor, and majesty; hod, majesty; geut, rise, illustriousness, presumption; and gedula, greatness. The King James also translates Aramaic rebu, greatness, and hadar, majesty, as majesty. In the Apocrypha, a variety of Greek terms are translated as majesty in reference to the deity, to Jeremiah in his preternatural angelic state, or to Mesopotamian kings, such as the great Persian monarch Artaxerxes. Now that I got through that word, the rest of this talk is going to be easy. Artaxerxes. That's his name in the apocryphal book of Esther. He's the monarch who marries Esther. The King James translation of the New Testament also renders the Greek megalosune, greatness, and megaleotes, grandeur, splendor, majesty, as majesty. Where and what context does the term majesty appear in the King James Bible? What is perhaps most striking from a bird's eye view is that majesty most often applies to the deity. Many of the usages refer to Yahweh as the supreme covenantal God and King of Israel, from pre-monarchic to post-exilic times. Some of these instances of majesty are added headings, and actually there are lots of additional headings, chapter headings, and page headings in the King James. Others translate the Hebrew or Aramaic. For instance, the King James frames Yahweh's giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, recounted in Deuteronomy, with the heading, Majesty of God. With the unification of the tribes of Israel and centralization of power, the majesty of Yahweh becomes embodied in the dynastic kingship of the house of David. Tellingly, the King James Bible uses the term majesty to describe David and Solomon as they take on increased power and prestige, develop a centralized administration, and implement a dynastic succession. 1 Chronicles in the King James Bible, for example, uniquely uses the term majesty when Solomon succeeds David to the kingship of a united Israel, stressing the grandeur of divine and earthly kings. In the 1 Chronicles account, then, David names Solomon as his heir, and the people bring sacrifice to the Lord. David's prayer attributes majesty to the divine. So this is the quote. "Blessed be thou, Lord God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heaven and in the earth is thine." While the Hebrew original, hod, easily allows a translation of majesty as well as power and splendor, earlier English Bibles use such terms as thanks or praise. As Solomon, anointed by the priest Zadok, ascends to the throne, the King James Version depicts him receiving majesty from the Lord. "And the Lord magnified Solomon exceedingly in the sight of all Israel, and bestowed upon him such royal majesty as had not been on any king in Israel before him." That's 1 Chronicles 29:25. Again, earlier English Bibles had rendered the Hebrew original with variations on "so glorious a kingdom." The wealth, power, and prestige of Solomon, whose empire stretches from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, makes him an appealing model for the ambitious King James, who in fact recurrently compared himself to Solomon. And the distinctive use of the language of majesty here is striking. So just to reiterate the point, no other earlier English translations use the term majesty there. They use different synonyms. The King James translation of the Book of Psalms also offered important instances of the conflation of human and divine majesty. The Davidic thanksgiving for victory in Psalm 21 attributes majesty both to God and the king. Hence, this psalm moves from, quote, "The king shall joy in thy strength, O Lord, and in thy salvation how greatly shall he rejoice," 21:1, to "His glory is great in thy salvation, honor and majesty hast thou laid upon him," 21:5. Notably, earlier English translations do not take the Hebrew term hadar to mean majesty, but rather honor or great worship. Similarly, Psalm 29:4 in the King James Version stresses the majesty of the divine voice. Quote, "The voice of the Lord is powerful, the voice of the Lord is full of majesty." While the King James translators render the Hebrew original, hadar, as majesty, earlier English translations use other terms such as glorious, with honor, or in magnificence. Psalm 45, 2-4 again conflates human and divine majesty in its praise of King David. Quote, "Thou art fairer than the children of men, grace is poured in thy lips, therefore God hath blessed thee forever. Gird thy sword upon thy thigh, O most mighty, with thy glory and thy majesty. And in thy majesty ride prosperously, and thy right hand shall teach thee terrible things." Here, not only majesty, hadar, but the most powerful right hand and terrible deeds distinctive of Yahweh become attributes of the earthly King David. Of earlier English translation, only the Bishop's Bible uses majesty here. Later psalmic praise in the King James Version continues to employ the language of majesty. Psalm 96, 5-6 lauds divine creation. Quote, "For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Honor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary." Again, most earlier English Bibles had chosen other terminology. The original is hadar, glory, worship, or magnificence. The King James Bible's translators likewise render David's praise of the divine in Psalm 104, 1b to 2, as thou art clothed with honor and majesty, who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, who stretcheth out the heavens like a curtain. Psalm 145, 5 to 6 in the King James similarly uses language to describe God that echoes earlier praise of the king. In this translation, I will speak of the glorious honor of thy majesty, Hod, and of thy wondrous works. And men shall speak of the might of thy terrible acts, and I will declare thy greatness. Here the usage is not unique, but reaffirms a select number of the earlier English translations, including the Bishop's Bible. The King James Old Testament also applies majesty to Mesopotamian kings, some of whom usurp the attributes of the divine. The book of Daniel offers two ominous instances of such false assumption of majesty. Nebuchadnezzar, the great king of Babylon, proclaims his own majesty just as he is about to be struck down with madness for his failure to acknowledge the supremacy of the Israelite God. Hence Daniel 4:30, quote, "The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" Here, Aramaic hadar is rendered majesty in most earlier English Bibles, as well as in the King James. But Nebuchadnezzar's restoration after 7 years of madness more distinctively uses the language of majesty in the KJV. At the same time, my reason returned unto me. I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Here, while the King James renders the Aramaic rebu, greatness, as majesty, earlier English Bibles use worship, glory, or magnificence. The story of Belshazzar in the book of Daniel also foregrounds divine punishment for usurped majesty. Responding to the Babylonian king Belshazzar's plea to interpret the handwriting on the wall that has ominously disrupted his great feast, Daniel reiterates the lessons of Nebuchadnezzar which Belshazzar has failed to learn. O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor, and for the majesty that he gave all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne. That's Daniel 5:18 to 20. The King James translators turn the Aramaic rebu into majesty, confirming a select number of earlier usages. Having failed to learn from Nebuchadnezzar's notorious disregard for divine majesty, Belshazzar meets a swift and sudden doom. The King James Old Testament also depicts majesty as part of divine judgment on Judah and on other nations. Isaiah, an 8th century prophet in Judah, asserts divine majesty in envisioning a coming kingdom and the destruction of Judah's enemies. Under the heading of "Wickedness is the cause of God's forsaking," he exhorteth to fear because of the powerful effects of God's majesty. So that's the heading they add in to guide the reader. Isaiah 2:10 reads, "Enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust, for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty," a Gedullah. The chapter ends with a vision of men fleeing into the clefts of the rocks and into caves for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. In both instances here, the King James reaffirms the usage of majesty in the vision of divine power and judgment in other English translations. So, sometimes it's unique, sometimes it's solidifying or reaffirming. Finally, the exilic prophet Ezekiel evokes divine majesty in his oracles of judgment against Judah and Jerusalem, including his vision of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem because of their cultic sins. And this is a quote, "As for the beauty of his ornament, he set it in majesty," that's Gedullah, "but they made the images of their abominations and of their detestable things therein. Therefore have I set it far from them. And I will give it unto the hands of the strangers for a prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, and they shall pollute it." Ezekiel 7:20 to 21. Again, the King James Bible consolidates earlier usages of majesty here. Let me just briefly say, we didn't go through all 72 instances, but those are examples, and I pulled out the examples that are going to be most relevant for what happens in the historical events that come next. In highlighting Majesty, both through the translation of the varied original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek words, in chapter and page headings, and in an opening dedication to the king, the 1611 Bible built upon and employed ancient traditions of majesty linked with monarchs such as Solomon, David, and even the Babylonian rulers Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. King James may well have envisioned the new Bible translation as enhancing monarchical power, as ridding England of the popular Geneva translation with its subversive marginal notes, and bolstering himself as the divinely anointed and divinely appointed head of the established church and state. Pragmatic, canny, even cunning, and willing to compromise when necessary, James managed to hold together divergent forces in the Church of England. The king could not have foreseen that one of the most important roles this new Bible would play would be as a resource for the monarchy in crisis and defeat. So this is part 3, the King James Bible, Charles I and Civil Wars. And you can turn to the page on your handout that has the frontispiece from Icon Basilicae. Like his father James, Charles I embraced biblical language to enhance monarchical authority. But unlike his father, Charles was thin-skinned and imperious in manner, not prone to consultation or compromise. Charles's concern with order and hierarchy in church and state was implemented by loyal high church prelates and bishops such as William Laud, Bishop of London, and eventual Archbishop of Canterbury. As tensions heated up in the late 1630s and early 1640s, the King James Bible inspired both reverence and revolution. Much attention has been given to the saturation of biblical language in the manifestos and speeches of the godly, including those of Oliver Cromwell, parliamentarian and country gentleman who rose through the ranks to lead the parliamentary army and eventually take power as Lord Protector. But the Bible was a contested authority, equally accessible to Roundhead and Royalist. For King Charles, the biblical language of majesty proved crucial in life and in death. For John Milton, removing majesty from Charles I meant rewriting not only royal propaganda, but also the King James Bible. Tensions over Charles I's high church policies, fiscal innovations, and rule without parliament, followed by an ill-judged attempt to impose the English Book of Common Prayer on Presbyterian Scotland and the resultant Bishops' War, brought England into full-fledged civil conflict by 1642. In December 1648, parliamentarians still wanting to negotiate with the defeated king were purged by force by Colonel Thomas Pride and his soldiers. The remnant of Parliament, or more properly of the House of Commons, set up a special tribunal, the High Court of Justice, to charge and try the king. The court had only the thinnest veneer of legality, and the king refused to recognize its legitimacy. Only when the perhaps foregone guilty verdict was handed out did Charles try to defend himself, and he was quickly silenced. Following the public execution, Charles I was buried without ceremony in the chapel at Windsor Castle. As Bishop Juxon was not given permission to use the outlawed Book of Common Prayer for the burial, this too was in silence. Yet if the king had no funeral liturgy, or even tombstone, a different kind of monument was constructed in print by loyal supporters whom the new regime struggled to contain. Most important among the elegies, sermons, and remembrances flooding a shocked nation was Icon Basilicae, the portraiture of His Sacred Majesty in his solitudes and sufferings. Available soon after the 1649 execution, and going through 35 English editions in the first year alone, Icon Basilicae was likely compiled by clergyman John Gauden from papers written by the king himself while imprisoned. The text was presented as the king's own prayers and meditations. Through 28 chapters on the events of the Civil War, each concluding with a prayer, Charles I examined his conscience before God, prayed for his people, and considered his own death. Scholars have noticed how the poignant first-person account found an immediate and wide audience, an audience that could identify with the king as Christian, husband, and father. But the book's power also came, I would argue, from its dual depiction of Charles as Christian and king, as everyman and divinely anointed sovereign, whose majesty was inherent and ineradicable. The psalmic depiction of kingly majesty violated and betrayed by enemies appealed to divine majesty for redress, justice, and punishment. So we're going to see, not only draws on the King James Bible and on the Psalms of the King James Bible, but he draws on some of those unique translations, some of the distinctive uses of majesty only in the King James we're going to see are used in the book Icon Basilicae. The subtitle of Icon Basilicae, The Portrait of His Majesty in His Solitudes and Sufferings, indicates that this would be a paradoxical portrait of sacred majesty alone and suffering. The book opens with a frontispiece by William Marshall of The King at Prayer. So now that's what you have in front of you. The image makes apparent the doubled nature of the text. Charles gives up his earthly crown for a Christ-like crown of thorns. He tramples earthly glory under his feet. Yet he remains a king, clothed in regal ermine. The viewer is reminded at once both of the king's humility, his role as an exemplary Christian searching his conscience and preparing to meet his Maker, and the unique majesty that is signified by the royal robes. Majesty inheres in the king and links him to divine majesty. The language of the King James Bible helped to enhance this majesty, challenging and reinterpreting the parliamentary display of justice and punishment. The frontispiece of Icon Basilicae links Charles with both the biblical David and with Christ himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. As the king meditates on and prays over the various events of civil war, searching his conscience and ending every chapter with a prayer, he speaks in the language of the Psalms and Gospels, figuring his own agony, his desire to forgive both as David and as Christ. The King's Book brings the ancient biblical text to bear on immediate political circumstances in mid-17th century England. Reinforcing the sacred majesty of the title page, 9 of the 28 chapters in Icon Basilicae contain the appellation Majesty. Such chapter titles range from Upon His Majesty's Calling This Last Parliament, and Upon His Majesty Going to the House of Commons, to Upon His Majesty's Retirement from Westminster, Upon His Majesty's Letters Taken and Divulged, and upon their denying His Majesty the attendance of his chaplains, to Meditations upon Death and His Majesty's closer imprisonment in Carisbrooke Castle. In discussing politics and Civil War events, Charles defends His Majesty in part on legal and political grounds, insisting on his own freedom to govern by the law as he sees fit. Charles denies that, quote, the majesty of the Crown of England is bound by coronation oath in a blind and brutish formality to consent to whatever its subjects in Parliament shall require. Charles refuses to, quote, betray the sovereignty of reason in my soul and the majesty of my own crown to any of my subjects. But the text also widely uses Christian sentiments and the biblical language of majesty. Charles professes to forgive those subjects who have turned against him. And indeed, I desire always more to remember I am a Christian than a king, for what the majesty of one might justly abhor, the charity of the other is willing to bear. The King's Book links an attack on kingly majesty with an attack on the divine, evoking conflation of kingly and divine majesty, such as we saw earlier in Psalm 45, 2-4. The king writes, "'Tis no wonder if men not fearing God should not honor their king. They will easily contemn such shadows of God who reverence not that supreme and adorable majesty, in comparison of whom all the glory of men and angels is but obscurity." Charles goes on to align himself with the figure of Moses and the majesty of God that we saw uniquely rendered in the King James version of Deuteronomy. "Nor shall their black veils be able to hide the shining of my face, while God gives me a heart frequently and humbly to converse with him, from whom alone are all the traditions of true glory and majesty." Above all, Charles embraces the persona of King David, using the psalmic language of majesty. having depicted himself as like David, surrounded by enemies who seek to slander the footsteps of thine anointed, unquote. The king prays, quote, Thou, O Lord, art the fountain of goodness and honor. Thou art clothed with excellent majesty. Make me to partake of thy excellency for wisdom, justice, and mercy, and I shall not want that degree of honor and majesty which becomes the place in which thou hast set me. Here Charles evokes the distinctive language of majesty in the King James translations of Psalm 21:5, honor and majesty hast thou laid upon him. Psalm 96:6, the Lord made the heavens, honor and majesty are before him. And Psalm 104:1, thou art clothed with honor and majesty. The psalmic language and prayers of Icon Basilicae translate or move divine and kingly majesty from ancient Israel to the immediate circumstances of the English Revolution. Despite the king's insistence that he forgives his enemies, the language of divine majesty implies that those enemies will be avenged by a higher hand. Icon Basilicae was perhaps the best seller of the 17th century, appearing in multiple editions from tiny duodecimos, small enough to hide in a pocket, to large octavos. Considerable evidence attests to the book's being widely and carefully read. Early readers affirmed the role of majesty in the king's book and in the portrait itself. And for another project, I've looked at hundreds of copies of Icon Basilica, and just two that are relevant here. There's one in the Bodleian, in the Beinecke, where somebody has taken this frontispiece and pasted on silk and ermine over the printed text. And there's one in the Folger Library that someone has gone in and inked, colored it in ink, so turned it from black and white into color. Early readers inscribed not only their ownership signatures, but their family histories, births, baptisms, weddings, and deaths in the King's Book. Indeed, the usage of the King's Book most closely resembles the treatment of family Bibles. So the kind of writing that you find in this Icon Basilica is something that you simply don't see in other early printed books, but you do see in Bibles that have family records. But as we shall now see, not all early readers were similarly persuaded. I've actually never found a copy of Icon Basilica in which somebody has written something negative, which also kind of attests to people. It would be like writing something, it would almost be blasphemous. But there's certainly, Icon Basilicae started there were certainly attacks in print, but the book itself becomes is modeled on the Bible and then becomes in itself a kind of sacred object. That didn't stop Milton. That's what we're going to hear about now. Defending the Revolution, John Milton's polemical prose. Early readers responded to and battled over the King's Book in print. The now best known of these responses was that of poet and polemicist John Milton, who supported the 1649 regicide and had been hired by the new Council of State to compose and translate diplomatic correspondence. Among Milton's new duties, to prepare a rebuttal to Icon Basilicae. In the opening preface to his Iconoclastes, in answer to a book entitled The Portraiture of His Sacred Majesty in His Solitudes and Sufferings, Milton disclaims any desire to combat the dead, and especially dead kings, who most often prove but weak and puny adversaries. And now you can turn to the second to the last page on your handout, and we're going to start with a prose quote at the top. When you begin this track, you think Milton's finally going to say something nice about the king because he says he doesn't want to debate with a dead king, but it actually turns out that he doesn't want to because it would be such a weak and puny adversary that there wouldn't be any accomplishment in it, any honor in it, in that regard. Milton explicitly sets out to strip away the ethos of divine majesty. This is the top quote. Nevertheless, for their sakes, who through custom, simplicity, or want of better teaching have not more seriously considered kings than in the gaudy name of majesty, and admire them and their doings, as if they breathe not the same breath with other mortal men. I shall make no scruple to take up this gauntlet, though a king, in behalf of liberty and the commonwealth. Part of Milton's strategy is simply to leave Majesty out of his chapter titles, as he quotes and rebuts the king's arguments in polemical, sometimes scathing language. So each chapter in Iconoclastes corresponds to a chapter in Icon Basilica, but Milton silently changes the chapter titles. Hence, the chapters of Iconoclastes become upon his going to the House of Commons, upon his retirement from Westminster, upon his letters taken and divulged, upon his going to the Scots, and so on, with Majesty from the original titles silently deleted. Another part of Milton's strategy is to mock the king's professed concern for his majesty. To the king's defense of his bringing armed gentlemen into Parliament, Milton jeers, "Gentlemen indeed, the ragged infantry of stews and brothels, the spawn and shipwreck of taverns and dicing houses," adding, "an illustrious majesty, no doubt, so attended, a becoming safety for the King of England, placed in the fidelity of such guards and champions." To Charles's resistance to seeing the majesty of his crown as bound by his coronation oath, Milton replies testily, "What tyrant could presume to say more when he meant to kick down all law, government, and bond of oath?" Milton also challenges the king's appropriation of psalmic language and the persona of David. He borrows David's psalms, but had he borrowed David's heart, it had been much the holier theft. Elsewhere, Milton adds scornfully that it is not hard for any man who hath the Bible in his hands to borrow good words and holy sayings in abundance, but to make them his own is a work of grace only from above. While Charles, quote, borrows here many penitential verses out of David's Psalms, so did many among those Israelites who had revolted from the true worship of God. Yet while chastising the king for his illicit use of biblical language and precedent, Milton's endeavor to strip majesty away from the king moves away from biblical authority. Milton emphasizes legality, that majesty originates with the people. And what were all his most rightful honors but the people's gift and the investment of that luster, majesty, and honor, which for the public good and no otherwise redounds from a whole nation into one person. Far from majesty being a God-given, sacred, and ineradicable quality of the monarch, it is the conditional gift of the people. When the king fights the parliament and his people, Milton argues, he, quote, fights against his own majesty and kingship, and then indeed sets the first hand to his own deposing. On the subject of majesty, Milton finds legal language more amenable to his argument than the biblical texts he has attempted to wrest away from the king. Asked again to defend the fledgling English Republic, this time to a European audience, Milton once more took up, among other topics, the question of majesty. In his Latin Defense of the English People, 1651, Milton continues to attempt to strip majesty away from kingship, but in doing so, he not only rewrites Icon Basilica, but also the King James Bible. Moving away from the biblical presentation of majesty as a divine attribute sometimes given to earthly kings, Milton translates, in this case firmly moves majesty into a secular and political context, querying, what king's majesty, high enthroned, ever shone so bright as did the people's majesty of England? Speaking of the time of revolution and regicide, Milton turns to Roman history and the majesty of the Roman people. From Cicero, he concludes that in our reading, we find majesty in those days more frequently ascribed to the Roman people than to kings. Against the European scholar Claudius Salmasius, who had castigated the English regicide, Milton argues, As you have endeavored to take all power out of the people's hands and vest it in the king, so you would all majesty too, a delegated, transferred majesty, if you will, but surely not their original primary majesty any more than their original primary power. Milton moves on to the question of treason or lay majesty. A king, you say, cannot commit treason against his people, but a people can against their king. And yet a king is what he is for the people only, not the people for him. It's a little hard to parse Milton's quotes, but they basically turn things around so that it's the king who commits treason against majesty, the majesty of the people. It's like it turns upside down the royalist defenses. And he goes to Roman history, and particularly the history of the Roman Republic, for a lot of that language. Later, Milton responds to Salmasius's claim that no legal basis exists for charging the king with treason by applying the same defense to Parliament, nor say I, do they, the laws, declare that Parliament can be guilty of lese majesty in deposing a bad king, but our laws do plainly declare that a king may indeed hurt his own majesty and diminish it, yes, and wholly lose it. Milton firmly lodges majesty in the people and the Parliament rather than the king. In so doing, he rewrites the nature and significance of majesty as found not only in Icon Basilicae and other royalist defenses, but in the King James Bible. Part 5, Paradise Lost and Majesty Divine. And yet Milton continued to evolve a concept of majesty that could incorporate the Bible and divine majesty without attributing that majesty to human kings. Milton's Paradise Lost, on one level, continues the redefining and dispersal of majesty with which we see Milton grappling in his regicidal prose. The poem, however, takes up in the form of narrative and theme the challenge of how to strip majesty away from earthly kings without stripping it from the divine. Paradise Lost depicts divine majesty largely in reflected, mediated, and parodied forms. In his theological treatise, De Doctrina Christiana, Milton considered the majesty of God under the rubric of the language of accommodation, asking, how does the language in which the Bible describes God convey divine truth without derogating from divine majesty? Paradise Lost takes up in its narrative related questions. How is the majesty of God reflected in his creation, both in proper and improper forms? How does kingship usurp divine majesty? How does divine majesty reassert itself through punishment and mercy? In his epic retelling of the fall and redemption of mankind, ranging in space from hell to heaven to earth, and in time from the exaltation of the sun to the last judgment, Milton points to the splendor and power of divine majesty and the dangers of false usurpation. As Paradise Lost opens with the fallen angels in hell, we see and hear nothing of divine majesty until the war council, when the fallen angels and soon-to-be devil Mammon propose that they build an infernal kingdom out of their own, imitating the majesty of heaven through the material riches of the kingdom of hell. And this is the last quote on this page with the prose quotes. This deep world of darkness do we dread. How oft amidst thick clouds and dark doth heaven's all-ruling sire choose to reside, his glory unobscured, and with the majesty of darkness round covers his throne, from whence deep thunders roar, mustering their rage, and heaven resembles hell. As he our darkness, cannot we his light imitate when we please? Mammon points the fallen angels gathered in consult in their newly built palace of Pandemonium toward the quote, desert soil of hell, rich with gems and gold. But as the wary reader recognizes, the war council debate on how to defeat an omnipotent God by force or deceive an omniscient God by fraud is doomed. Blinded by avarice, wrath, sloth, and ambition, the angels misread their remnants of heavenly glory as evidence that they can rise and regain their lost power. When Satan's right-hand spokesman, Beelzebub, majestic though in ruin, rises to cut off the debate and proposes a satanically inspired, easier enterprise of seducing man to sin, the reader sees the debasement of the remaining vestiges of divine majesty. Paradise Lost dramatizes the dangers of taking on attributes of God by depicting satanic rebellion as in part a false usurpation of divine majesty. Satan is a false ruler, a false king. As Book 2 opens, Satan appears high on a throne of royal state, presiding over the infernal council. Later, the reader sees a similarly false satanic exaltation in the war in heaven. And now we're on the last page of the handout, and actually in the last section of the paper. High in the midst, exalted as a god, the apostate in his sun-bright chariot sate, idol of majesty divine, enclosed with flaming cherubim and golden shields, then lighted from his gorgeous throne. Satan, like the biblical Nebuchadnezzar, displays false majesty precisely at the moment he is about to be overthrown. Both idol maker and idol, Satan will be driven out as terribly as the fleeing subjects in the visions of Isaiah and Ezekiel. Indeed, it is Ezekiel's chariot in which the Son of God rides in Milton's epic account, driving the rebel angels before him out of heaven and into the gulf of chaos and hell. Thus, in Paradise Lost, such usurpation only enhances the power of divine majesty, shown in punishment and in mercy. Countering satanic destruction and war with goodness and creation, Milton's Son of God, with radiance crowned of majesty divine, enters a second time into a chariot to create new worlds. If Milton's prose attacks on Stuart majesty moved away from biblical sources, in his epic, Milton reclaims the biblical story. Paradise Lost depicts the primeval moment of angelic rebellion as a false and doomed kingly usurpation of divine majesty. Majesty fully evinced in divine action and in turn reflected in new divine creation of earth and humankind. Hence, in the innocence of Eden and in nakedness rather than splendor and wealth, Milton's Adam and Eve reflect the majesty of God. This is the middle quote on that last page. Two of far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad in naked majesty, seemed lords of all, and worthy seemed, for in their looks divine the image of their glorious Maker shone, truth, wisdom, sanctitude severe and pure, severe, but in true filial freedom placed. The poem's first description of Adam and Eve overturns all preconceptions of earthly majesty and strikingly contrasts to royalist uses of Adam as father king. Stripped away from association with material wealth, with power over nations, with Solomonic riches and empire, majesty is relocated in the Edenic couple and in the virtues of honor, truth, wisdom, and sanctitude. And indeed, majesty characterizes Milton's Eve more than his Adam. Majesty is an attribute not so much of Adam, head and guide in Milton's Pauline gender hierarchy, as of the graceful but subordinate Eve. The epic narrator describes, now this is the last quote, and it has the obligatory typo in it. What you might have thought were typos earlier weren't typos, that was all old spelling. But the last quote does have a typo. The epic narrator describes how Eve, perceiving that Adam is about to begin an abstruse dialogue with a visiting angel, with lowliness majestic and grace, rises from her seat to work in the garden, among her fruits and flowers, to visit how they prospered. So actually, I didn't read the part with the typo. You have a longer quote here. Adam recounts to the angel how a newly created Eve assents to their marriage. Seeing me, she turned, I followed her. She what was honor knew, and with obsequious majesty approved my pleaded reasons. So there are 4 or 5 instances in Paradise Lost where majesty is used not with Adam, but with Eve. Milton returns to his biblical base with the language of majesty in Paradise Lost. Divine majesty, falsely appropriated by Satan and the rebel angels, although appropriately evinced in the earthly creation, cannot legitimate earthly monarchy. Eve, more than Adam, receives the language of majesty. The poem both reasserts the majesty of the divine and defines that majesty in such a way as to hinder any kind of identification with earthly kings. As such, Milton's poem recuperates the biblical language of divine majesty that was absent from Milton's polemical prose, but so strikingly depicted in the King James Bible. Satan, going the wrong way. But if Paradise Lost powerfully employs biblical language and descriptions of majesty in terms apart from earthly monarchs, the poem appeared in a changed political world. Begun in the late 1650s, by the time the epic poem was published in 1667, the dissociation of majesty and monarchy could only be made in the literary realm. For the Stuart monarchy was back, and the people to whom Milton had ascribed majesty had bitterly disappointed him. In the ready and easy way to establish a free commonwealth, 1660, a tract desperately attempting to stave off kingship, even as the king's return became a near surety, Milton castigated a nation that followed in the steps of both backsliding Israel and the corrupt Roman Republic. Quote, how they can change their noble words and actions, heretofore so becoming the majesty of a free people, into the base necessity of court flatteries and prostrations is not only strange and admirable, but lamentable to think on. In March 1660, Parliament invited Charles II, son of the executed Charles I and grandson of James I, to return from more than a decade of exile and resume the English crown. Charles returned in May 1660 to wildly enthusiastic crowds. A lavish coronation and resumption of the full accoutrements of kingly majesty would follow. And now I want you to turn back to the front page of the handout, because I'm going to mention the bottom half of the illustration. With the return of monarchy, the established Church of England was restored. And a revised 1662 Book of Common Prayer included a new liturgy for commemoration of Charles I as royal saint and martyr, a commemoration that would remain in the prayer book until 1859. As the martyred King Charles gained a new afterlife as Anglican saint, his son gained the crown imagined in Icon Basilicae, and at least some of his unlucky enemies received harsh punishments of hanging and quartering. That's what's in the bottom half of the illustration. Beginning in 1662, the King James Bible replaced the Great Bible as the official version used in church liturgy. It was perhaps not the story that James I had envisioned when he endorsed a new translation of the Bible, but majesty had at last returned to the Stuart dynasty on earth and in heaven. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
And that would certainly strike some Puritan ears as blasphemous, that suggestion. And I'm curious, I'm very intrigued by the tracking of the word majesty. And indeed, the Polemical text is detached from monarchy. And,
Yes.
And give people, it fits in with the notion of no king but Jesus.
Yes.
Do you have any sense of when that notion of blasphemy in the association of majesty and kingship started to arise?
Well, do you think it's, even during the English Revolution, I'll partly answer this and then I'll throw it back. Even during the English Revolution, I'm not sure blasphemy would have been the term that would have been used to critique the ascription. I'm going to throw this back in a minute. The ascription of majesty to the king, that linking of one of the problems that the revolutionaries had is that linking of the divine and the human is biblical. And of course, Milton and others went to other biblical books because kingship in the Old Testament you can find both positive and negative depictions. It's a mixed account, but trying to pry that away, trying to undo the Psalms was very difficult. Now, the fifth monarchists, who want King Jesus to reign on earth, they were so, I don't know if they're so caught up in their idea of Christ himself appearing in person. I mean, millenarianism as you know, has, and as probably many of you know, becomes very widespread when Charles is executed. And there certainly is the expectation that when Charles is executed, that's going to be the onset of the millennium, or that Christ himself is going to come and rule in England. It doesn't happen. They keep getting disappointed, but they turn their energies more against the fifth monarchists. Really turn their energies more against the figures whom they think have spoiled Christ coming back on earth than they do against this idea of the attributes taken on by the Stuart monarchy as they simply don't. That's not where they focus their energies, and that's also not where the genesis of the movement comes from. Does that answer your question, or did you want to respond to that? Yeah. Okay. Oh, yes, absolutely. Right. 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 Yes. There's Milton's early works tend to have more usage of majesty, and his early Psalms translations sometimes use the word majesty where it isn't used in other English translations, but then at a certain point it becomes politicized and he has to move away from it. But yeah, even early on, his own works would be a counterexample to what you see later. Yes.
The great number of editions of Icon Basilica indicate great sympathy or great interest in a big event? Is it like reading People magazine or?
I think it's great sympathy. It turns it basically the decision to put Charles on trial publicly, to set up a court, to have witnesses. The witnesses come in and they say they need to charge him with tyranny and treason. They have a whole slew of witnesses who talk about having seen him on the battlefield, and then that gets turned into, especially after he kind of starts the war up again. 1646, he's captured. He escapes and kind of starts things up again, and they hold him responsible for that bloodshed. So Parliament wants the parliamentary figures and who've been ones who are radicalized by the events of the Civil War. The army comes around to wanting to try and execute him, but to do it publicly, to kind of to shame him, to turn him into a criminal. What Icon Basilica does is overturn that and basically make the execution, the public execution, backfire. It really backfires because even with the execution itself, even at that moment, you have contemporary accounts that talk about how the crowd groans, how they groan, and right around you start seeing a lot of comparisons between Charles and Christ in sermons right before that time, and just providentially, one of the scripture readings for the day in which he's executed is I think it's the Passion narrative, but it's one of the narratives that reflects on the crucifixion. So Icon Basilica is just a huge runaway bestseller. People buy multiple copies. It's very quickly prescribed, and they try to imprison their different printers. They're moving around with it. They put the They interrogate the printers and put them in prison, but they can't contain it. It's just everybody wants to have it. Also because it has his image, has a visual image of the king, and some people take that image off, but they get smaller and smaller, and people put them in their pockets. There are many, many remaining copies. It goes through 30, I may have said this, it goes through 35 editions. It gets translated into multiple languages. Milton's book, by contrast, is really a kind of a flop. Has 2 editions, and it gains him a lot of opprobrium, but he can't combat the kind of sympathy that the king's book generates for the king himself. Later on, his prose has more of an impact later on in the 17th century, but right at that time, he can't really do anything. It's not effective with most people. Yeah.
Yes, I'm very taken with the story of Milton reclaiming Majesty from a Republican perspective.
Yes, it's completely ironic. Or, yeah. Yeah.
A simpler strategy might be to look to other words. And I wondered if you see that elsewhere in Milton's writings or in contemporary. Is there a strategy of looking for replacing Majesty? Either through, say,
Okay. Yeah.
terminology or theological terminology, where it comes to mind the sovereignty, either from a Calvinist or
Right. That's a very good question, and my guess is that you could definitely look at other words. He's often talking about justice and truth. Those are 2 very big words for Milton. So liberty. So there are certain kinds of words that are central to his political and religious thought all the way through. And in some ways, I would say Majesty isn't even one of them at the beginning. It's surprising. It's surprising that Majesty is one of the terms used in Milton's more anti-monarchical, tyrant, but also Republican writings. So there are definitely other words, but I think what's striking about this is the way that and I'm going to think about that more, but it's striking that the centrality that Majesty does play. But it also gets at that kind of tension between the classical and the biblical in Milton's thought, the way the two with not just humanism, but Milton is bringing those 2 strands together. And in the the Republican tradition, the majesty of the people does become, that is one of the major strands, but it's just something, it's in the 17th century in England, it's so completely inherent, so completely part of the monarchy that it's hard for him to get it, to get it back or to use that word in any way that it's surprising to find him using it. But I think what he does in Paradise Lost is very different than what he does in the prose that just precede that. And it does show, this is probably the other comment make in response to your question, it does show that he's struggling with it and he's having a hard time with it. Or at least he's struggling with it and grappling with it, and he does something different when he gets to Paradise Lost. Yeah.
What about Rule 3 of Paradise Lost?
Okay.
I'm straying to
Okay.
but does he use the term majesty in regard to the God of God the Father or the Son? I don't remember.
I don't think so. I'd have to look again, but the instances with the Godhead in Paradise Lost, several instances, all the ones I gave, so it's first where it shows up just briefly with the fallen angels. What's very striking about Majesty in Paradise Lost is that it's mostly, what I said at the very beginning, it's deflected, it's lost, it's parodied. It's not the straight head-on majesty of God. So I'd have to look back, but I don't think that he uses it in Book 3. It has that kind of dialogue, when he has the dialogue between the Father and the Son. And then possibly it shows up in the angelic hymn, but I was tracking, the usages with a concordance, and I was struck in Paradise Lost how it tends to be, in some ways it's also, he does that with other values like liberty. He's almost always talking about liberty being perverted or lost, or you need to regain it. So there's kind of this kind of fragility to it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yes. 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 Yes, that's good. Mm-hmm. Right, so the majesty gets shown, well, it's in the reflection of the divine, but then it's in the reflection through these internal virtues. And when you think about the majesty of kingship, partly you simply think about the throne, the robes, the orb and scepter, the material, aspects of majesty, and this completely goes against this in a way that you can't be correlated as cleanly with earthly majesty. Of course, what Charles is doing in Icon Basilica is different too, because there he's on his knees, he's not on his throne, and that's in some ways an even harder kind of assumption of majesty by the stewards for him to combat. But this doesn't look like King James. It doesn't even look like Charles. Charles I, who does have those internal virtues in Icon Basilica, but he still has the appearance of being a king on the frontispiece.
Well, please join me in thank you.
Thank you.